Okay, well, welcome to this chat with the early childhood students in the graduate diploma. Just for the sake of the students, I'd like to just introduce you to them and to say we're very delighted to have Dr. David Armstrong to speak with us about aspects of emotional intelligence and the relationship between that and early childhood education, which of course is the assignment that the students have to complete as part of their course. And Dave is an expert in child development and psychology, so he'll be able to give us some insights from that broader perspective, which you will then be able to apply to your assignment. So let's get underway. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about your work around this idea of emotionality and teaching, and why it's so important?
I'll start with my first kind of experience, both of very young children and of older adults in educational capacity. I ran a unit that worked with the homeless for 4 years. And one of the things which I noticed coming in was that many of the people who were coming in, these were adults, also teenagers, were often had difficulties with emotions. And the purpose of the unit was to basically reconnect, get people off the street, get them back into education, housing, health, all their needs. So I ran the education part of that. And I noticed a pattern that they had issues with emotions and with expressing their emotions, containing and understanding their emotions. And this got me interested in psychology. And also at the same time, many of them, and this was a surprise to me, also brought in young children. So we had to do provision, not just for adults, often who had psychological and emotional difficulties around drugs and alcohol and life experiences, traumas of all kinds, but also their kids were in. So we had to think about, build in some early childhood provision, and what would that look like. So that was my first experience. I did that for 4 years. And then after a period of more mainstream kind of environment, worked at the Delissa School of Education, which is in South Australia, and worked there with scholars and also with their cohorts of early childhood students studying to be early childhood educators. So those are my experiences. And in between, I also worked with a range, I did consultancy for state government, working with some early childhood services, and particularly looking at kids, children, young people who were excluded. So many of these, it wasn't working, or there were issues around their social and emotional learning, they had disabilities, etc., etc. So that's what all of that got me interested in. And for teachers, the thing is that you have to cater for all of the learners in front of you. And we know from the evidence, from research evidence, that particular groups of students may have challenges with developing and responding to their emotions. So these are very young children who, for lots of different reasons, many different reasons, have issues around emotions. So that produces an extra need there, which early childhood educators have to respond to. You have to respond to the need in front of you as a professional. So that's the big thing from my perspective. You have a need, you have children with additional needs, how do you respond? On top of that as well, as a second thing, to make it even more important for our listeners, many mainstream children who don't have what later receive a labelling for a disability, also have issues with understanding and responding to their own emotions. So we've got two different groups. We've got children who we would regard as, brackets, quotes, mainstream, developing typically, is the more correct phrase. And then we've got children who are developing atypically. I know when just vocabulary there is a language, professional language there. And
Can you tell us what that means, Dave?
Yes. Basically, typical development, the child will be progressing along the developmental milestones that you'd expect. So, for example, in terms of reciprocity, I scratch your back, you scratch mine with other children, being reciprocal in their relationships with other children. There are developmental milestones there. And children who are developing atypically, that won't happen to the same extent or at the same speed as their typically developing peers. So that's the two, using from developmental psychology, the differences, atypical and atypical development.
Thanks, Dave. You've given us a couple of really key concepts to think about there. Would there be any others that you thought we would need to know at this very early stage for the students about to go out on placement, about to position themselves working with children? What are the key concepts you would want them to know?
They may or may not be involved in programs, interventions and strategies designed to help children learn and grow emotionally and socially. And that area is called social emotional learning, but in setting, that setting may already have programs and interventions and strategies in place to help that happen. So it'd be useful for them to ask about those and to learn a little or in setting about what that setting is using, because there are many and there are different variations and different levels of how they're applied. So it's really good to go fact find, talk to people in setting, ask them what they're using, what works for you, what are you using here? Can you tell me more about this? And which children does it apply to? Because there are different layers, and that'll help you understand and unpick what's going on and what you might need to take on board, your personal learnings.
That's kind of the next thing I think our students would really appreciate some help with. Because it's as much, if I understand this correctly, it's as much about the adult's emotional well-being as it is about the child. We know in early childhood, many studies have been done looking at the mental health and well-being of very young children. And statistically speaking, in a study I did recently, we were able to track that back to even their mother's pre-birth depression. So that we can see these links. So as an early childhood teacher, and I'm thinking here particularly if we're working with very young children or even infants, what do you think are the most important things that we should be attuning ourselves to emotionally?
There's obviously it's really a really interesting area, and it applies across education, across every area of education, right through, everyone you can think of really, where you're interacting, where an adult teacher or educator role is interacting with students. You need to be mindful of your own welfare after work too, not just at work, but also after work. What's the impact of what's happened today on you? And the stresses and strains that you'll be experiencing in everyday practice, but then the heightened states you might be coming into when incidents happen in setting that you have to respond to, and you and colleagues. And that's one of the key things really. It's about feeling you're part of a team. Isolation is bad. You should be responding to things in concert with colleagues, talking to the head of setting or to manager, whatever their title is, whoever's leading that setting, and keeping them involved in what's going on as far as you can to give you some support, so you're working as a team that's reducing the stresses and strains on you. Burnout is an issue across all areas of sectors of education.
And I guess this would be true too for if things happen in your own personal life and then you arrive at work.
Yeah.
So for example, something really bad's happened at home and I go and try and build a really important, close, intimate relationship with an infant, for example, and they're going to be picking up on my cues. Hugely
challenging, and the literature on burnout, not much, interestingly, has been done in early childhood settings, but there's been quite a bit in other settings, primary and secondary and tertiary and blah, blah, blah. So we have to assume similar processes, it's an assumption, are happening. But just to define burnout for the audience, this kind of psychological exhaustion, you're exhausted, and that has implications for your personal life and for your own resilience and health implications, high blood pressure, etc., etc. So now, this is early childhood settings, like most education settings, can be challenging, really challenging environments, and particularly something about very young children who may be coming from risky environments. And the model here to think about, just for a way to help you navigate this as well, is to think about risk and protective factors. That's a good model, and that's quite widely used in developmental and psychological literature about this issue. So when you're looking at a child, so thinking more about a child here, what they're presenting with, thinking about what protective factors they have. For example, peer relationships can be one. Having friendships with other kids in setting, for example, we know that's one of the key protective factors. But normalising relationships to help children manage their own emotions and interactions. We also know on the other side, one of the risk factors, as you just said, can be a home environment where parents are using drug and alcohol, have chaotic home lives, have economic stress due to job insecurity. You think about stressed households here, and children obviously are coming from those, and we know that looking to more extreme environments, and I can talk a little bit about this, where there's major trauma. I worked, just a little bit of a story here, just to keep you listeners kind of interested, and the viewers rather. I worked with 7 young people who were in a project in South Australia, and they were called under the guardianship of the minister, which means they were in the care system, essentially. And these kids all had a diagnosed mental health difficulty that presented also with challenging behaviours. So they had a mental health problem, but they had really quite severe damaging behaviours to themselves and to adults in the environment around them. So, and these are all children that were classified as having high needs, attracting, I was told, approximately $50,000 worth of funding each child annually. So a lot of care, different people, psychologists and all sorts of other professionals are involved with each child, multidisciplinary. So children with high needs, and the focus of the project I was involved in and worked and evaluated was about helping inclusion to happen. So when they're in the education setting, these are all young primary age children, they weren't early childhood settings, but they've been referred and picked up in early childhood settings, and their needs have been identified at the end of just as they came into primary school. So this is making it really relevant for your viewers and listeners. So you might be dealing with children like this who later on, the ones I've just described, have really high needs due to very traumatic backgrounds, and these children have things like fetal alcohol syndrome, which is where basically their biological parent, mother, has consumed alcohol and caused organic damage to the developing child, essentially, through alcohol consumption. It's known as fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, and they have a distinctive kind of, quite often, shape to the head. So a couple of kids I worked with had FAS. Others had just had extremely severe traumatic environments where there'd been violence in the home, and they'd been physically attacked, and then had to be taken out of the home environment, taken to care, essentially. So these sorts of children, we're talking about really traumatic backgrounds, can occur. Thankfully, they're still, we have to keep it in perspective, relatively rare, but they could be in your setting. It could be one of these kids could be in your setting, and if they are, then when we're thinking about social and emotional learning, you're thinking about a whole new level of what you need to do to give them support and the kind of coordination work that will be happening. But just to put you some calmness here, as a new educator, you wouldn't be doing this on your own. There'd be many of the more senior staff in setting that would be, have already done a lot of this work. But you'd be coming in and you'd be learning, and you might be seeing and experiencing and watching what's happening with this child and seeing what events, transpire as they go through setting. So that's something to think about, and again, I'm kind of encouraging your viewers really to have a developmental perspective if they can.
Yeah.
So where's the child come from before they came to me in my presence, in my setting, and where might they go next, and what are the things I need to work on to travel through, so we're giving them the best protective chances we can, reducing the risks down. What do we need to do to sort of offset the risks?
I guess it's too, what you're describing is a bit of a balance between not allowing the developmental phases or stages of expected norms to disrupt our understanding of this child in this place, in this time, but at the same time being mindful of where it might be that they ought to be in case there's some signals that things are not going well, And the students are doing a lot of observation work at the moment in this course, Dave. So they're looking at observation through play. So there might be some clues that they might be interested in looking out for in terms of the peer relationship, the way children position themselves within the peer group, for example. Not to say that that's going to create a big alarm bell that they're going to then have to report to the authorities, but certainly at this very early stage of the early childhood qualification, to be aware of what might be cues or things actually to talk about with your mentor teacher.
Well, play is, we think about, and that's in the presentation I've written this, think about play is one of the key, how do we know for young children, how do they develop that social and emotional learning and those skills and competencies, how do they do that? It's through play and relationships.
Of course.
The development, forming of relationships, friendships, starting to understand friendships, and as that become more complex as you get older, more nuanced, moving through, the end of early childhood phase through into, what we now middle childhood and the primary setting aspects of education, as those friendships become more complex. But they start early on. We're talking about kids in friendships, start to understanding, often increasingly complex ways about what a friend is, and it becomes less kind of symbolic and more less simple, more complex. So you'd be looking at what the kinds of friendships a child had. Do they have friendships? One of the things we know about kids with disabilities, in all sectors of the education system that I've read, again, early childhood is a little short on research here, but we have to assume it's the same, is that kids with disabilities often don't have the number of friendships that their typical developing peers have. They don't have as many friends, and they don't have as many good friends either. So again, that's a risk factor for a child if they're not having friends out there to help them to learn the skills, interact. So I'd be asking your viewers to think about, what number and type of friendships does the child have, and what have they seen in terms of backing up, who are they friends with, and what kind of interactions do they have with the friends, what's that closeness, is there reciprocity, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and you can look at, what kind of play do they do in the friendships, is it symbolic, is it quite complex play, is it parallel play, what are the different phases?
And we're just learning about that at the moment, so that's really relevant.
Fantastic.
But also, Dave, I'd like to return back to the the role of the teacher, because particularly for very young children, before even those peer group friendships are made, they are forming bonds with the adults. And when we know that, for example, a large number of infants now are spending more hours a day in an early childhood context than they are with their own families, what would you say to an early childhood teacher working with infants and developing their own relationships? What would you think were the most important? For example, we know from the early childhood literature that establishing trust, continuity and consistency of caregiving practices is really important. You used it earlier about this calmness, being able to be calm, and the adult not bringing their own emotional, baggage into the room. Because if we think about the circle of trust that the students are also learning about, it's about the adult being bigger and stronger in that context. So is that the kind of thing that you would think was important, and would you like to add anything else to that?
Absolutely. I think you said it precisely and eloquently, actually. But and this is one of the tricky aspects, but also very rewarding aspects of being a practitioner in any area of education, is having that role. You are, and it's really important, I think, you conceptualise yourself see yourself as the secure base for that infant, child, young person, whichever. You are the secure, you are that voice of calmness and learning and support for that child, and you're there, and it's really important, I think, that you show unconditional regard. I go back to that phrase. Really, you let them know that you are there for them, whatever they do. Obviously, that doesn't mean you won't tell them, show them, speak to them if it's inappropriate, and tell them what the right behaviour is, and that's part of the crucial part of your role and to help them develop. But they need to know you are the secure person in their lives, because some of them might not have any other secure person. You might be the only adult there that can offer that, really, and if they've got a disrupted family life.
And this might be something that you students have a look out for when you go into your placements. To what extent is there a consistent caregiving relationship? How are the rules and boundaries kind of conveyed? How are children's emotional needs met? And also, when the going gets tough, how do we respond? Because let's face it, you're not going to get through a huge amount of time, hours and hours in an early childhood centre without something being slightly confronting or challenging.
Yep.
And so thinking very much about how it is that you want to position yourself, how you prepare yourself. What would you say about that, Dave? What do you think is important?
It is, and now there are different ideas on this. I've seen different approaches used in practice, and I think the most important, my recommendation, is that you feel that you are part of a team. Isolation and feeling that it's your responsibility solely is the thing to avoid. You should be aware that you're part of a team, and you should have time to debrief with your team. When things go wrong that are confronting, you need some time every day to debrief with your team and get things back to normal. Also, there's a practical need there. We know on the structures around how to respond to what we call critical incidents in setting. These are the incidents that cause real challenge for everybody. They're where things go very wrong. And we know from you need to plan for when that happens. So that means having, as an individual level, as a practitioner, thinking through what are going to be my responses if things don't go as planned today, if X, Y, or Z happens, which it might do, and also think what happens if things that I didn't expect go wrong. How am I going to? Okay,
because to a certain extent, the students would be well advised, would you think, to check out the policies that are in the centre. So there'll be a positive guidance policy. There'll be even things like nappy changing policies, because those are in early childhood speak, we call those prime times for learning, when they're very intimate moments, nappy changing, going to sleep, eating, feeding, all those things, as you'll be learning in this course, are prime times for learning through routines. So they're not, it's not that we only have learning when children are in activities. They are learning through actually you. You are the environment, in a sense, particularly with very young children. And even things like your heartbeat, the pace that you bring to the way you move, the pace of your voice, the tone of your voice, all those things can create calmness.
On voice, I just have a recommendation, is that you need to go up and down with your tone. You need to modulate it. It can't be just a steady tone, of course, to keep interest and engage with the child, but also to form relationships. But you also need to have that calmness. And when things are more difficult, it's even more important that you are that calm centre, and you bring that calmness to your environment and around the interactions with the child. Because again, in the home environment, it may be that parents scream and shout, or are not so calm with the child, let's say. So it's quite good that you bring that calmness to them to help them adjust and be able to learn and grow. Learn and grow. So the other thing about preparing is, now again, it's interesting because we don't often talk about this. Really, professionals don't often talk about this, but like I said, we know from the planning for what could go and be able to visualise it and think what's the worst that could happen. Not to give yourself a trauma, but just to think, how would I to bring that fear down, really, to bring that fear down, and then think, plan for how am I going to respond, and then afterwards, exactly what am I going to do when I respond exactly? Am I going what were the right thing to do? And then afterwards, debrief. What did we learn? how did the policies, was the policy, was it working when that incident happened? There's some good resources around actually. The Government of Western Australia do a nice, we can recommend something on how to respond to critical incidents in setting.
Okay, maybe you could give that to us to put in Canvas.
Yes, I could put you the link.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so
Coming back to that, just to wind things up now, because the students, of course, are going out on placement. They're faced with this right now, and we're asking them to look at their own emotionality, how responsive they are. And you said that, you know, if you not to raise your voice and all these things, all wonderful things, and I totally agree. But what do I do if I've come from a background where that's a pattern for me? You know, what would you be recommending the work that I did before I went out into an early childhood centre? What kind of work could I do to support me in maybe targeting one aspect that I could take with me, or and then my second part to that question is, if I did that, how can I protect myself? Because you know, perhaps for some of us, that's going to bring up some issues from our past, emotional things that come up as we're exploring ourselves. And what would you suggest for our students if that were to happen?
They need to be flexible. They need to try and have remind themselves, if possible, to have some flexibility, and to switch off and to say stop before you act. Stop and think. It's a good strategy to use, where there might be a trigger for you to want to behave or in a certain way because it's brought back a memory or an emotion that you find it difficult to cope with. Stop and give yourself some space to help process that emotion. Don't push it away. It serves an important function. You need it. It will hurt you if you push emotions away all the time. It's not good for you.
That's a really important point.
Yeah, but that from counselling. But so to have time to process that emotion, but do so in a more appropriate way. So stop and think and give yourself a few minutes just to deal with that. If you need to just obviously pass over to colleagues, make sure colleagues are in the know, say I just need a minute. Have yourself a minute and come back rather than just respond, because that could be damaging for you, damaging for the child.
So you mean like almost physically remove yourself if you possibly can?
If you absolutely need, just for a minute, if it's reawakening a trauma that you've from your own childhood that you're having to deal with, which is what we're talking about, then you need a minute. You might need a minute just to respond to that quickly, just to rather than brush it off, push it down, because that'll come out later in the day. You see, you can never destroy emotion completely.
You'll go round and round the same mountain, won't you?
Yes.
As a teacher, and it seems to me that what we know about all the things we've just discussed, it's that probably one of the most important things a teacher can do who's preparing to teach is to take care of their own emotions and try and understand their triggers in order to be able to support children to understand theirs. You know, and we haven't used the word today, social regulation, but that's certainly very big in the early childhood literature around being able to regulate your emotions, and I think that's really what you're saying here, Dave, is that regulation is so key.
Well, we know from, again, if you're using principles, I mean, if you were going to be a little bit more kind of technical about it, cognitive behavioural therapy, one of those signals are about you recognising your emotions, and often they give you physical symptoms too. You know, you'll be physically affected by some of the emotions you might experience. So being able to recognise those and then give yourself space to tell yourself, I know what that is. I'm a bit worried today because I'm coming. I didn't have a chance to have my coffee this morning. It was all a bit really fast paced coming in this morning into setting, and I haven't had time just to calm myself down a little before I started. So that just giving yourself a minute just to regulate that sense of over kind of worry is good. And also, again, the other thing is if there's more serious issues that are more keep coming up, you need to think about, well, how am I going to deal with these? Who do I need to speak to? What's the actions I can take? You might want to go and speak to somebody if that's coming up more consistently, but that's something else again.
And of course RMIT has loads of support for students if there's something should come up. First port of call is your mentor teacher in the centre.
Yeah.
then your mentor lecturer,
Yes.
then your course coordinator.
Counselling services.
Counselling
extremely good.
service,
We
yeah.
have,
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, they're extremely good, and you can refer yourself individual or through the GP practice here if you prefer, and book yourself in with one of the registered counsellors, and they're all registered counsellors as well, so you know the quality's good.
I think that's really key because sometimes you hear stories of students who are have had emotional issues, for example, while they're on placement. I mean, life happens.
Yeah.
Something can happen that causes you to go into a different emotional response.
Yeah.
And then there are some cases where it's not appropriate for you to be with children, particularly infants. I do stress this with infants. Of course, it's important for all children, but especially so for infants. And that you need to know that you won't be punished for having that experience. It's a case of letting us know so that we can find the best way forward. Would you agree, Dave?
Absolutely, yeah. You have, the responsibility there is for you to recognise that, to get some help, get some support, and take it from there. Essentially, that's really important that you do that. You're active and proactive to look after yourself.
And I know that you've given us a wonderful lecture to have a look at the slides as well, that the students can have a look at in Canvas, which has more technical issues around some of the concepts.
Yes.
We've also given you readings, and Dave's had a part to play in that. There's an interesting New Zealand resource that's just come out that I've put up for you, which has actually been developed by the Ministry of Education, where teachers can go through a checklist to check themselves in terms of what's happening in the environment for emotional and social development. So there's a few resources there that you can also look at. But just before we wrap up, Dave, is there any last minute pieces of advice or really important things that you would like us to know?
I think I'd just stress that you have positive, unconditional, positive regard for children and infants in your care. That's really important, and that extends to yourself as well. To give yourself, look after yourself really is part of that.
And I'm even thinking, because I've written about love in early childhood. People say, well, you shouldn't talk about love for other people's children, but it is something akin to love, isn't it? Because it's a regard. I love the way you use that term, regard. And concern and care, and all those things wrapped up into one, which are actually the role of an early childhood teacher. It's not just about chalk and talk by any means.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So on that note,
thanks
very much for talking to us.
I've enjoyed it. Pleasure.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank
Bye.
you.